The purpose of this video is to describe Robert Lindsey's theory of how the Synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke came into being, and how those Gospels are related to one another. Lindsey believed that the first stage took place when one of Jesus' disciples, who was an eyewitness to the events, recorded the words and deeds of Jesus in Hebrew. Lindsey believed that the second stage took place when someone translated the Hebrew story into Greek. Lindsey believed that the Greek version employed a highly literal style of translation, so that many of the Hebrew features of the original story were preserved. The next stage took place when someone reorganized the content of the Greek translation. This editor took the teachings apart from the stories that occasioned them, and the parables apart from the teachings they illustrated. Each of the three types were organized into a separate section of the scroll, which Lindsey referred to as the anthology. Yet another stage took place when someone who knew only the anthology decided to create a continuous narrative out of the literary fragments he saw in the anthology. Lindsey referred to this source as the first reconstruction. One of the features of this source is that it attempted to polish the Greek style of the stories it included. Lindsey believed that the Gospel of Luke is the earliest of the three Synoptic Gospels. The author of Luke had access to two sources, the anthology and the first reconstruction. Luke's method was to select a story or saying either from the anthology or from the first reconstruction to include in his own gospel. As a result, Luke's editorial fingerprints are relatively light. For the most part, he faithfully reproduced the wording of his sources. His main contribution was in the selection and arrangement of the stories, teachings, and parables he decided to include. Lindsey believed that the second of the Synoptic Gospels to be written was the Gospel of Mark. The author of Mark also had two sources, the anthology and the Gospel of Luke. Mark's method was to select some stories from Luke, to edit them partly on the basis of the anthology, with the result that the Gospel of Mark is a paraphrased, epitomized form of the Gospel of Luke. Mark's editorial fingerprints are relatively heavy. Rather than reproducing the wording of his sources, he preferred to paraphrase, adding dramatic elements and allusions to biblical stories and drawing parallels between the stories of Jesus and the experience of the early church itself. Lindsey believed that the final Synoptic Gospel to be written was the Gospel of Matthew. The author of Matthew also had access to two sources, the anthology and the Gospel of Mark. Matthew was able to share some stories with the Gospel of Luke that had been omitted by the Gospel of Mark because he used the anthology, which Luke had also used. The result was the Gospel of Matthew. Rather than selecting a single source to reproduce as Luke had done, Matthew tended to blend the wording of his two sources, Mark and the anthology, whenever they shared the same stories. As a result, Matthew's editorial fingerprints are also quite heavy. Nevertheless, when Matthew reproduced a story or saying present only in the anthology and not in Mark, he often preserved it in a more original form than did the Gospel of Luke. Another editorial trait of Matthew was to collect sayings into large discourses, such as the Sermon on the Mount. Whereas Luke tended to reproduce his sources in large blocks of material, the author of Matthew was much more inclined to take bits and pieces from his sources and arrange them into new combinations. To review the stages of gospel transmission, first, there was the Hebrew life of Jesus. Second, there was the Greek translation of the Hebrew source. Then came the anthology, which reorganized the order of the material, and the first reconstruction, which selected some of the anthology's stories, polished their style, and created a continuous narrative. Next came the Gospel of Luke, followed by the Gospel of Mark, which was followed in turn by the Gospel of Matthew. In the next video, we will consider some of the phenomena we encounter in the Synoptic Gospels that Lindsey's theory is able to explain.